I am inclined to assume that most people in this room, hopefully all of us, who have decided to become Christians, understand at least in a fundamental way why Jesus had to die. I think that I understand that at this point in my life. I don't pretend to understand all the implications of that or how it all worked. In fact, there's a whole field of biblical study that's called atonement theory, because it is that complicated. I don't think any of us understand exactly how everything worked, but I think at the very least, we all have a functional grasp on why that had to happen. Because there's a group of sinners, the penalty for sin is death, and either the sinners were going to die or somebody was going to die for them. And I think if we're Christians, we understand that. But something occurred to me recently, I suppose while I was thinking about this. And so we know that the penalty for sin has been death from the very beginning. We read that in Genesis chapter 3. From the very first instance of sin, the penalty is death. And in the old law, animals had to die, not arbitrarily so much as symbolically, to pay for the sins of the people. But the animals that were sacrificed did not really have to suffer prior to their death. Not really. They didn't have to lead long lives of tenuous labor. They didn't have to get beaten up. They didn't have to die in a way that was horrific or inhumane or cruel to them. In fact, as I understand it, the process was gross. I mean, there's a lot of blood and it's disgusting, but it wasn't inhumane for the animals in question. So what was different about Jesus that made it necessary for him to suffer in the ways that he did? Or was it necessary at all? Did Jesus go through an unreasonable amount of pain for what he was trying to do? Because when you pause to think about it for any length of time, it can seem like maybe he did. Crucifixion, really? Was that? I mean, obviously a sacrifice had to be made, but why that way? Why in such a gory, horrific, inhumane way? And not just crucifixion, what about everything he went through before that? All the emotional hardship, the problems he experienced in his relationships with the people he loved. Why did Jesus have to suffer at all? And how does his suffering fit into the picture of his death and his resurrection? And that's the question that I'd like to present this morning. Why did Jesus have to suffer at all? And the Bible offers a two-pronged answer to this question. And the first part of the answer we can find in the book of Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 4. Hebrews chapter 4, beginning in verse 14. Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. And because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." As he also says in another place, "You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. And although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So in so many words, one reason that the Bible gives that Jesus had to suffer, not just in his death, but all throughout his life, was so he could function as our high priest. so he could be our perfect mediator. Because according to this passage, high priests could only really serve their function the way that they were supposed to if they had suffered themselves, or at the very least, if they could sympathize with the people who they were sacrificing on behalf of. Because remember, when it came to sacrifices, it was not just the act of sacrifice that God was interested in. I think the prophets make that pretty clear. It was supposed to be a lot more than that. There was a mindset involved. And when it comes to high priests, part of that mindset is an empathy toward the people that they're mediating on behalf of. So if Jesus was going to mediate a sacrifice of such magnitude as the one he was going to make, it stands to reason he would have to suffer too. And not just immediately prior to his death, but all throughout his life. Which is why we see that play out in the Gospels. Jesus was hungry and thirsty. In Matthew chapter 4, Jesus goes out to the wilderness. He fasts for 40 days. And when Satan comes to tempt him, the first thing he offers Jesus is food, which is not an accident. It wasn't a misplay on the part of Satan. He offered Jesus food because Jesus was hungry, probably really hungry. He was thirsty. We're told in John chapter 19 that while Jesus was hanging on the cross, he begged for something to drink, which makes sense because when you've experienced blood loss, when you've been beaten up, when you've been subjected after all that to hard labor, he had to carry a heavy cross at least part of the way to where he was going to die. You get thirsty. And Jesus was thirsty. He got tired. In Matthew chapter 8 rather, in verse 23, we're told there is a storm on the Sea of Galilee that is so tumultuous that the professional fishermen, the guys who are used to the bad weather, think they're going to die. And Jesus is asleep because he's been teaching all day and he's tired. He was homeless. Matthew chapter 8 and verse 20, Jesus says that animals have places they can go to rest. Animals have homes. Son of Man doesn't have that. Son of Man has no place to lay his head. He mourned loss. In John chapter 11, verse 35, we're told that Jesus wept with his friends at the death of Lazarus. Even though he knew he was about to raise Lazarus from the dead anyway, he participated in the pain of his friends. He suffered with them. He was socially ostracized. There is an exchange between Jesus and the Pharisees in John chapter 8 where they're discussing the issue of fatherhood and who your father really is. And Jesus is trying to make a point about that, and the Pharisees say, well, we weren't born from sexual immorality. We know who our father is. And that is a not so subtle dig at Jesus' mom. What they're saying is, we know your mom got pregnant with you before she was married. And we know who our father is. And it was a deliberate, cruel, leveled attempt to discredit him and ostracize him in front of the people he was talking to. He was betrayed. You read John chapter 18 and 19, he wasn't just betrayed by Judas Iscariot, but also by Peter. These chapters tell the story of Peter, who betrays Jesus, pretends like he doesn't even know him, swears and curses that he doesn't know him 3 times. He's betrayed by everybody who he needed most in the time when he needed them the most. He experienced stress, tremendous stress. In this passage, Matthew chapter 26 and verse 36 is when we find Jesus praying in the garden. It's where we're told his sweat was as drops of blood. And there's some discussion about how literally to take that, but whether you take it literally or not, the point is that Jesus was experiencing stress at an intensity such that it was taking a noticeable physical toll on him. He experienced overwhelming, tremendous stress, not to mention the fact that the people who were closest to him kept falling asleep on him while all this was going on. And then, of course, ultimately, he was tortured to death in a gory, horrific execution method of crucifixion. And the point, at least part of the point, of all of that was that the function of high priests was dependent upon, to use the words found in Hebrews, being beset with weakness. And in order to be the high priest and offer the sacrifice, Jesus had to be beset with weakness. And the fact of the matter is, there is simply no greater mechanism for the imposition of weakness on somebody else than physical suffering. There just isn't. But his function as a high priest extended beyond just calculated negotiation. Because high priests weren't just supposed to be mediators, they were also supposed to be mediators as one of the people. So in the early 1900s, 1904 to 1905, there was a war, a naval war between Japan and Russia. It's called the Russo-Japanese War. And nobody really anticipated that the result of this war would be for either side particularly significant. And they were wrong. Japan destroyed Russia in this war, annihilated almost their entire fleet, which nobody anticipated. And they beat them so badly that Japan started to grab up territory in Asia, in China and Korea especially. And the powers in Western Europe didn't like that very much. They didn't want Russia or Japan or any imperial power, really, to have strongholds in China or Korea or India. So what happened was the United States president at the time, is Theodore Roosevelt, was asked to come mediate between the two sides, try to keep Russia and Japan and Western Europe happy. They pulled somebody from outside the conflict, which makes sense to us. Right? We do this all the time. If there's a conflict or a relationship, oftentimes we will pull somebody from outside of it to come mediate. Couples counselors do this, foreign ambassadors. Right? The point is, like, we understand that. That's what happens in the real world. That was not supposed to be the case with high priests. God did not pull a third-party buffer to stand between him and his people. The whole point of a high priest was that they were mediating on behalf of a people they could empathize with. So in order to be our high priest, it stands to reason that Jesus had to be, in some sense, like us. Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 10, beginning in verse 10, says, "For it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. For he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source. And that is why he is not ashamed to call them brothers, saying, I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation I will sing your praise." So Jesus was beset with weakness through suffering so he could be, in a very real, very tangible sense, like us. So he could be one of our brothers, according to the book of Hebrews, because he had to be in order to really be our high priest, as they functioned in the old law. And so he had to suffer. He had to suffer so he could be our mediator, but also so he could be a mediator from within our ranks, in a manner of speaking. And according to the book of Hebrews, the mechanism by which Jesus was able to do that was suffering. So why did Jesus have to suffer? Partly so he could function as a perfect mediator, who was also, in a manner of speaking, one of us. Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 28 says, "For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever." But there's another reason for Jesus' suffering that the Bible offers, because he was more than just a high priest to us. He wasn't just the perfect person to offer the sacrifice, but when it came right down to it, he was himself the perfect sacrifice. And so another reason that Jesus had to suffer is so he could be the perfect sacrifice. And according to the Bible, in order to be a perfect sacrifice, Jesus had to exhibit a life of perfect surrender right up until the moment that he died. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 8, says, "And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father." So this passage essentially compartmentalizes everything that Jesus went through, because it is one thing to be obedient in death. But Jesus wasn't just obedient in death. He was obedient to the point of death, which implicitly means there was a series of obedience that led to his death. And then when it actually came to his death, he was not just obedient in death, but obedient to the point of death even on a cross, because as the Bible clearly indicates, by point of emphasis, it is one thing to lay down your life as an act of obedience to God. And it is another thing entirely to lay down your life in as gory and inhumane a way as on a cross, as a gesture of obedience.
That is another matter entirely, which is why the book of Philippians separates it from the entity of death. It's a point of emphasis. And so there is no better way to demonstrate perfect surrender, which is what Jesus had to do to be a perfect sacrifice, than to lead a life of struggle, die a horrific death, and perfectly submit to God's will the entire time. In his book, Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis kind of elaborates on this idea, I suppose, with this quote. He says, "Now if we had not fallen, it would all be plain sailing. But unfortunately, we now need God's help in order to do something which God in his own nature never does at all: to surrender, to suffer, to submit, to die." So in other words, we have been given one job as people, one task, and that's to lead lives of perfect surrender to God. And we are so inadequate at that one task that God had to come down and do it for us, infinitely better than we could ever do it ourselves, and it is not even in his nature to do it. And he still did it better than us. Because God can't surrender. It's not possible. There is no force or being or group of beings that exist that God can even surrender to. It does not happen. But if he could amalgamate his power and his character with a form that could surrender, with something that could die, that could suffer, like a man, then he could do the job that we never could. He could lead a life of perfect surrender. And the reason suffering had to be a component of that life is because there is no greater pressure, period, to stop surrendering than the pressure of suffering. So God, as a man, could face every threat to perfect surrender that we face as people, and more, without giving an inch, so that when the time came, he would not just be a perfect mediator for a sacrifice, but he himself would simultaneously be the perfect sacrifice. And that's why he suffered and suffered and suffered, because every instance of suffering was an opportunity to quit. And he never did. And so when it was time to die, he had proven himself to be obedient and perfect in ways that we desperately need to be, but cannot be. Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 9. Verse 8. "Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek." And that's what we're here to remember, to memorialize this morning. His death and resurrection are absolutely critically important, irremovable parts of what we're trying to do. But also his life of struggle, right? His hunger, his homelessness, his betrayal, the stress that he endured, the things that he went through up to the point of death, all endured because we desperately needed a high priest from our ranks who could offer a perfect sacrifice on our behalf. And there was just simply nobody else who could do it. Jesus was the only one who could have done it. Hebrews chapter 10, one last passage. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 7. "Then I said," this is Jesus speaking, "Then I said, Behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as it is written of me in the scroll of the book. When he said above, You have neither desired nor taken pleasure in sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings. These are offered according to the law. Then he added, Behold, I have come to do your will. He does away with the first in order to establish the second. And by that will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all." It was Jesus' obedience that was proven through his suffering that made him the perfect high priest and the perfect sacrifice at the same time by the time he died. And so that's why he had to suffer, not just prior to his death, but all throughout his life. And that's part of what we're here to remember this morning. So let's try to keep it on our mind as we partake.